So, the title of my talk today is What Went Wrong? So we will start discussing about the reasons why this strange combination between the policies and politics of memory and the rise of the extreme right is taking place and has been taking place over the last few decades. And the starting point of my talk is the acknowledgement, therefore, that the politics of memory have failed. Over the last 30 years or so, the victim-centered memory of the Shoa has filled the void that was left by the crisis of the great revolutionary utopias of the 20th century. Utopias that, conversely, told the story of the heroic quest for emancipation of the oppressed against their oppressors. As it became hegemonic, the Holocaust narrative sidelined, pushed away the revolutionary paradigm and found its way into the heart of Western consciousness, a bit like a cautionary tale of the catastrophes from whose ashes post-war Europe arose. But what transnational identity can derive its values from the solemn promise, never again? An identity that denies conflict as one of the primary constitutive possible human relationships. And indeed, it is not always very clear what never again refers to. Does it refer to anti-Semitism or to the persecution of any stigmatized minority? Does it refer to the extermination on an industrial scale, or does it refer to any other form of discrimination? Be it as it may, the simplistic equation, never forget equals never again, has become so deeply rooted that very few people consider questioning it, despite the abundance of counter-evidence. The upsurge of racist violence, parades with fascist symbols, the spread of hatred on and offline, xenophobic parties in power, and now even war. Why are we so reluctant to admit that something has gone wrong? I think that the unwillingness to admit the failure of the politics of memory is symptomatic of a principle of dogmatic, anti-liberal thinking that has insinuated itself in the folds of commemorative rhetoric, often unbeknownst to those who practice it, not aware of the fact that this is going on. Those who identify with democratic views are used to associating authoritarianism with the far right, where the appeal to indisputable dogmas is normal, is customary. But a subtler form of dogmatism also lurks in the ways in which, through the politics of memory, today's liberal democracies legitimize themselves in the eyes of public opinion. The paradox is that the memory of the Shoa, which has been elected as the supreme symbol of democratic values, is often promoted through devices that we could define as authoritarian. And today I shall enlarge on 4 of these. The first is the sacralization of witness testimony as the only kind of authoritative discourse. The second is the privatization of history as an asset to be spent on the public stage. The third is the appropriation of the language of the Holocaust by anybody interested in cloaking their partisan arguments with universality. And the fourth is the political use of criminal law as the shield against Holocaust deniers and other thugs of memory. Let's start with the first, the sacralization of witness testimony. Well, ever since survivors of the camps have been vested with a novel exemplary function by a culture more and more inclined to see the memory of the Holocaust as its moral barycenter, witnesses have found themselves performing a task that goes way beyond the normal transmission of knowledge that ensures the continuity of every culture. This is revealed with some embarrassment by various historians in private, who often finding themselves speaking alongside witnesses on official commemorations, feel unable to publicly correct any mistakes, factual errors, perfectly normal mistakes that are presumably caused by lapses of memory, false recollections, cultural interferences, and so on. But they feel that they cannot correct these mistakes because the way they are received these days, survivors are always right, even when they are manifestly wrong. A case in point, in an interview of April 2008, Vera Belmont, who was the director of the movie Surviving with Wolves, movie based on Misha de Fonseca's false Holocaust memoirs, she said, "I talked with Simone Weil about my film, and she told me that it doesn't matter if the story is real or sham. The important thing is the message it conveys, the value it gives to memory. The most important thing is that the audience can identify with the story." Now, with few exceptions, the witnesses themselves take pains to avoid claiming this kind of privilege. You just have to read Primo Levi in The Drowned and the Saved to realize that it wasn't them. So my criticism is not aimed at the witnesses and the survivors themselves, because it was the others, it was the institutions, the media, us, in a general sense, who attributed an almost religious value to their words, as if the fact of having been there in the sites of trauma protected them from any attempt at refutation. Now, the overall result is a gradual but inexorable delegitimization of the scientific historical method as a principle for the selection of the most suitable narratives. Its place is taken by a principle of authority. I believe this because he or she said so, which discourages any further inquiry into the credibility of the testimony and the lessons that may be drawn from it. Non-witnesses who wish to perform the duty of memory are expected to empathize with the suffering of the victims to the point of total identification with their claims, past and present. We are all Anne Frank, or whoever stands in that enunciative position. Now, what are the consequences of this symbolic shift? In a prevalently narrative truth regime based on the dogma of witness infallibility, very few people outside the specialized community feel the need to interpret historical events according to the verifiable criteria, the rules of the game, as it were, that scientific research is supposed to abide by. Rather, everyone has blind faith in the narrator to whom they have delegated the quasi-divinatory capacity to tell truth from falsehood. And what happens in the long run is that the community unlearns how to make judicious application of its own skepticism, and the only stories worthy of trust are those that confirm beliefs fixed a priori from their own sources of reference, whereas the accounts of others are automatically held to be false. It is no accident, I think, that naive credulousness keeps step with the popularity of the most disparate conspiracy theories. Hence, the mandate that is accorded to the guardians of memory, and by this I mean people, associations, institutions who speak in the name of the victims. They are witnesses of witnesses who draw legitimacy from a kind of osmotic contact with those who were there. The guardians protect the symbolic patrimony from undesirable incursions and violations, and they make sure that outsiders do not cross the threshold of the sanctuary, sometimes literally. They establish who may invoke the memory of the dead in support of their own cause by authorizing pertinent comparisons, who is the Nazi and who is the Jew, while sanctioning the inadmissibility of all other uses of memory. This, for example, was very clear during the war in the ex-Yugoslavia in the 90s, when all the groups involved in the terrible multilateral conflict framed their territorial claims in terms of Holocaust-like victimhood. and victimization. Such analogies obviously did not help understand, let alone solve, the complexities of that conflict. But at the time, several self-appointed Western guardians took it on them to establish who were the Nazis and who were the Jews. So it was okay to compare Milosevic to Hitler, less so to extend the comparison to the Croatian nationalists, and so on and so on. Now, it is natural for people to feel the need for such guardians in a context of unbridled competition between competing particular narratives that aspire to universal recognition, in the absence of other independent, albeit ideal, places to which they may refer to assess the relative credibility of each narrative. But the price of this substitution is high. The charismatic authority of the Guardians stands in for the enlightened project of a widespread critical awareness, the main guarantor of which is, or at least should be, correct argumentation. So it shouldn't come as a surprise if at a certain point the same principle of authority is brandished by those who, with greater historical coherence, use it to promote their own particular interests by any means necessary. America first, Italy for the Italians, Hungary for the Hungarians, Ukraine as the cradle of Russia, and so on. Point 2, the privatization of history. The contradictions of the cosmopolitan, so-called cosmopolitan memory lurk in the contrast between the presumed universality of the core narrative and the inevitable specificity of the uses that are made of it. As Sandra Gilman was saying earlier on, memory simply can't be universal. It is always instrumental to the interests and sensibilities of whoever controls it and controls its formats in that particular moment. One of the distinctive functions of memory is, in fact, that it always belongs to somebody, to someone who considers it as a personal emanation and therefore feels that he or she can do whatever he wants with it. This is why, even when someone recollects an event poorly, calling up non-existent details, omitting disturbing elements, and so on, something that we all do, by the way, no one can ever dispossess them of their memory, imperfect as that may be. I could be wrong, but this is what I remember. My memories belong to me. Now, while a person's full ownership is indisputable in the case of individual memory, matters get a little more complicated in relation to the so-called collective memory. To speak of our memory implies that all individuals who we refer to as us share the same representation of the past. Now, reaching a suitable agreement about recent events is in itself quite a difficult task. Who decides which episodes are to be included or omitted, which details deserve emphasis, which relationships of cause and effect should be established, which interpretation should be called for, which points of view favored, and especially who has the last word should the versions not correspond. Obviously, things get even trickier when the events in question refer to a distant past. What gets sacrificed when the past is framed exclusively in terms of memory is the public nature of history. The problem isn't so much establishing how things really went, nor in how many different ways the same events could be told. Rather, it's a question of claiming the rights, the priority of one's point of view in relation to those events. There is a perspective that automatically prevails over the others, and the heritage to be preserved is the unchallengeable memory of an emotionally loaded experience that no historical reconstruction can ever empty of its subjective contents. This is precisely the problem. There's the rub, as Shakespeare said. Whereas the crux of every universal discourse is, this holds good for everyone, the point of every identitary discourse is, I alone have experienced this, and no one else will never know what it feels like to be me. Now, combine these two together, and what do you get? You get a strange chimera. I alone have experienced this, and therefore it holds good for everyone. In other words, precisely because my experience or that of my group is mine alone, precisely because I hold sole rights to my or to our memory, the particular claims I put forward on the basis of that experience and that memory should be universally acknowledged. One cannot escape from this contradiction, as shown by the endless disputes surrounding the ownership and control of memory, and each country has its own. 3, appropriation of the Holocaust lexicon. Today, we are so accustomed to considering the memory of the Jewish genocide as a milestone in the European consciousness that most people, as was already said earlier on, are surprised when somebody reminds them that the Europeanization of the Holocaust is a fairly recent question. The process, as we know, began in the 1990s, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when formerly communist countries gradually came within NATO's sphere of influence and asked to join the European Union. As Tony Judd famously said, recognition of the Holocaust became, quote, the contemporary European entry ticket for states aspiring for Western recognition. Now, the policymakers' reasoning was very simple, too simple, in fact. Given that identity is a narrative construct, and given that so-called national identities are also the result of planned processes of storytelling, why not act in concert to break the container of national memories and disseminate, using the substantial tools of global communication, a narrative that was to be abstract and deterritorialized enough to combine the worthiest parts of a Europe in search of a new identity. A Europe as the paladin of human rights that, along the lines of the American dream, was to be multi-ethnic, tolerant, and welcoming, and whatnot. Now, on closer inspection, the memory of the Holocaust and more in general of 20th century totalitarian violence also served another purpose. It illustrated the triumph of liberalism, seen as the light at the end of the tunnel and the ultimate end of history, after which there was no point asking whether there were any alternatives. In fact, the idea of building a post-ideological, would-be universal, victim-centered narrative was perfectly compatible with the support of neoliberal market economy on the one hand and the protection of human rights on the other that was championed by the theorists of the so-called third way. But what had not been foreseen was, among other things, the extreme adaptability of the Holocaust narrative to the uses that various nations would make of it with regard to their own specific self-narratives. To celebrate the nation arisen from the ashes, Israel. To dissociate themselves from the worst phases of the genocide, France and also Italy. People keep forgetting that Italy is, just like France from that point of view, actually worse. To extol their role as liberators, the United Kingdom and the United States. Germany's case is obviously far more complicated. With the arrival of former communist countries within the European sphere of influence, the dominant narrative was further adjusted. The cosmopolitan model devised to gather together the old continent around a sole anti-totalitarian memory paradoxically encouraged a multiplication of local memories, each aimed at emphasizing the episodes that made the victimization of that specific community stand out more, while nonetheless maintaining the calque, the empty form of the Holocaust as the rhetorical narrative frame of reference. One example among many, starting from the 80s and 90s, the memory of the great Ukrainian famine of 1929 to 1933 was framed as a crime against humanity on account of the role played by the Soviet Union and Stalin in causing the conditions that led to the death by starvation of several million people. But the legitimate call for recognition was sometimes accompanied by a far more debatable conspiracist interpretation regarding the reasons for the world's indifference towards the Ukrainian disaster. The same background that had inspired numerous pogroms and the collaboration with the Nazi between 1941 and 1944, and that no later than January 2019 led the parliament in Kiev to declare a day of commemoration in celebration of the deeds of Stepan Bandera. The nationalist propaganda of the 1990s not only denied or minimized the historical acts of violence against Jews perpetrated in Ukraine, but in some cases, it revived the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes to blame the Zionist Jews identified with the Bolsheviks, both for the famine of 1932-33 and its blameworthy deletion from the collective memory. So at this point, we have moved on to another type of appropriation, the exploitation of the Holocaust as an empty narrative in which anyone, even anti-Semites, as has been proved before, can take up residence and portray themselves in the role of victims, as such, deserving of indemnities and special immunity. It's not solely a matter of claiming historical wrong suffered as a cause for identitary pride and of considering memory as a useful instrument in the pursuit of political aims that are legitimate per se, the survival of a state, the regeneration of a community, the emancipation of an oppressed group. In some cases, recourse to the victimary narrative serves to cover projects of hegemonic self-affirmation, aggressive sovereignty, and the suppression of dissent. And speaking of the suppression of dissent, I move to the last point, political uses of criminal law. The aspect in which the authoritarian drifts of the policies of memory are most evident is that relating to the anti-denial laws in force in Europe since the 1990s. For several years, many historians have contested this interference of politics in fields that shouldn't really belong to it. This has not prevented the promulgation of the European Framework Law of 2008, which recommends that all member states of the Union have laws that criminalize the denial and gross minimization of Nazi, fascist, and by extension, communist crimes. Now, not only do anti-negationist laws clash with a fundamental liberal value of freedom of expression, but they also run the risk of producing diametrically opposite effects to the ones that they pursue, insofar as they allow the deniers to portray themselves as martyrs of democracy. Holocaust deniers rehabilitate the people who burned books while crying, "Ideas must not be censored." And this is the paradox of contemporary negationism. But beware, this paradox works well in conjunction with an opposite yet specular paradox, the idea of combating the revival of Nazi beliefs through censorship. The two are a system, make a system. One exemplary case is the so-called Garudi Affair. Some of you might remember it. Garudi in France in November 1995. He was a former communist converted to Catholicism and then to Islam, who published a thinly veiled negationist work in which he maintained that the state of Israel had exploited the, quote, myth of the Holocaust to legitimize its expansionist policies. The French press raised the controversy, and in accordance with the Guesso law, the law that had just been passed a couple of years before, Garudi was sent to trial. In the meantime, it was announced that the Venerable Abbé Pierre, who that same year had been voted as France's best-loved public figure, supported Garudi on trust, even though he hadn't read his work. Abbé Pierre's declaration caused a considerable sensation, leading to the usual emphatic stance on the right of speech, of free speech, that, of course, needless to say, the negationists immediately exploited. So Garudi's pamphlet was published in Egypt, reviewed enthusiastically by several Arab papers, and Garudi himself was given triumphal welcome in Damascus, Amman, Beirut, and Tehran. Surfing the wave of his success, other European negationists made contact with Middle Eastern countries, where, at that point, untrammeled by any need to make their discourses seem neutral, they were free to adopt openly anti-Semitic tones and positions. This was how negationism took root in the Middle East and was put to the service of the most virulent anti-Zionist propaganda. So, allow me, if I have the time, just one last personal comment. Punitive memory laws may be framed within a growing tendency to limit freedom of expression. In other words, to multiply crimes of opinion in the name of other democratic values, such as security, law and order, or the safeguarding of collective identities. From this standpoint, anti-negationist laws are some way comparable to anti-terrorist legislation. For example, the law on cyber surveillance that was passed in France in 2014, or the First Amendment on terrorist offenses introduced in the Spanish Penal Code to criminalize the apology for terrorism as well as the terrorist act itself. More and more inclined to blur the boundaries between violent conduct and propaganda in its favor, these legal measures that are taken to oppose hate speech flatten the distinction between saying and doing, words and action, physical violence and its justification. Now, I know it may well be that Holocaust deniers, for example, if they could, would turn into thugs and torturers of Jews in the flesh. But within the perimeter of the system that we consider democratic, or that so far we have considered democratic, a virtual crime needs to show other signs of wanting to become real before the state is authorized to intervene to nip it in the bud, because otherwise we are dangerously close to the world of Minority Report. And this is where punitive memory laws reveal their darkest aspects and implications. Are we really sure that the struggle against racism is the primary objective of those who support this legislation, this kind of legislation, despite the objections that have been put forth? Or, as many are beginning to suggest, could it also be regarded as an educational tool used to preserve consensus, to mold and reinforce collective identities, to emphasize internal cohesion even when there is none? Like, whatever we are not negationists and we are not terrorists. To shift internal conflict towards the outside, towards the exterior. Because what do terrorists and negationists have in common, if you come to think about it? If not the fact of being beyond redemption, the kind of people that you do not speak with or to out of principle. And possibly to pave the way for the criminalization of other forms of dissent, therefore to curtail public discussion on certain sensitive issues. And I'm not just speaking out of my head, because the fact that memory laws lend themselves to a drift towards authoritarianism is proved by the uses made of them in many countries where the crime of negationism not only extends to a steadily growing range of other historical crimes, but also affects the way in which these events are classified, interpreted, or narrated. Couple of examples. The Czech law of 2009 includes casting doubt on Nazi and communist crimes among the positions that are liable to prosecution. Casting doubt. Lithuanian law of 2010 punishes the negation and the trivialization of the crimes committed by the Soviets during the independence struggle of 1990-1991. So it's not just the Holocaust. The Slovenian law of 2011 extends sanctions to deriding, making fun of an indefinite range of genocides, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other crimes of aggression. And the Polish law of 2018, as we know, penalizes anyone accusing the Polish people of complicity with Nazi crimes, which is a historical fact in many. So how far can the tendency to remove a theory, no matter how authoritative, from the sphere of dialectics actually go? Could the crime of negationism one day be applied to the negation or casting doubt of other scientific truths, such as the efficacy of vaccines, the effects of coronavirus, or global warming, or whatever you want? Because once the precedent has been set, the crime of negationism could serve the most disparate interests, not necessarily in line with science, provided they have the backing of whatever political majority happens to be in control at the time. So a disconcerting hypothesis looms in the horizon. The onset of new forms of racism and ultra-nationalism has not come about despite the shield of memory. Remorseless insistence on the duty of memory has partaken of the same cultural climate in the last 30 years, and perhaps has even unwittingly encouraged it, thereby contributing inadvertently to the rise of the new waves of xenophobia. This bouleversement, however, was implicit in the premises, namely in the pretension to endorse the ultimate values of democracy through the use of subtly authoritarian methods. So in short, yes, the new right has hijacked Holocaust memory, but I'm afraid we have taught them how to do it. Thank you.